Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the moderator of the next session, Steve Clements.
Nice to see all of you. I hope I have entertained you in other places. I'm Steve Clements. I'm editor-at-large of The Hill. Today we're talking about something called the coming convergence. I don't know if it's coming convergence or the coming divergence. Technological connectivity and security advantages. And we have a great panel. Nick Psaki, just to my left, who is the Chief Intelligence Information Architect of the U.S. Army. He was retired from that role, but let's just say, once you're the chief information architect, you're always the chief information architect. And then we have Radoslav Danilak, who is the CEO of Takium, another friend. And we also have online, I hope, Elizabeth Braw. Elizabeth, greetings. How are you? I'm looking over at you. I should be looking at the camera to see you, but it's great to see you joining us from the American Enterprise Institute, where she is also a senior fellow working on national security and defense policy. Let me just open up and start the conversation. And Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you and sort of ask you to help lay out and kind of create a map for us about what the points of concern are that our audience needs to know about this coming competition and application of AI, 5G, Internet of Things, big data, this next new set of platforms that we're jumping into, and how, essentially the United States and its allies are faring compared to others that are making similar kinds of investments. Can you set that stage for us, Elizabeth?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to watch over you here from afar and to be part of the panel. So I think that the biggest concern by far that we have to worry about is that we are lagging behind, we're falling behind. And I think we're so used here in the West to being ahead. We have the best thinkers, the best innovators, but R&D investment has been dropping for some time. And that would be a concern in itself. But at the same time, China is making enormous investments. And not just China as a country, the Chinese government essentially has a lot more leverage in steering its industry towards what it wants it to do than the governments in any liberal democracy, simply because they have less power to intervene in industry. But in the past, we had the great advantage here in the West that large defense contractors, for example, the so-called primes, they put a lot of money into R&D investment, and that share of investment has been decreasing. And so we can't count on that innovation advantage anymore. In fact, we should be extremely concerned that we don't even have it anymore. And so the question is, who will innovate? Who will put the money into it? And I think I'm speaking as somebody who was previously a technology correspondent in San Francisco. I think here's where we have so much potential and so many fantastic brains, but they need to be incentivized to be part of R&D innovation in national security. And that could happen, and I know the Defense Innovation Unit is working on it in the US, but we have so much more potential, and it's urgent that potential be tapped into.
Before I jump to Nick and Brado, I want to ask just you to drill down on one element, because you've raised China and the investments that it's making. We've heard the stories about facial recognition software, social capital, and so on. And I guess my question to you is, Microsoft, under Brad Smith, wrote a book called Tools and Weapons that looked at a lot of these forthcoming technologies as those that could be used maliciously against people or positively for national security, but you had to make key choices. And so my question is, from a competitive perspective, from an industrial perspective, from a commercial perspective, does the United States, does the UK, does its allies end up being less competitive by being worried about the human rights applications of these technologies when China is not concerned, seemingly, about the application of these technologies in some of these socially disconcerting applications? Elizabeth?
Oh, thank you. I didn't get your cue there. So there is that point, yes. And so if we essentially behave well the way liberal democracies should and respect human rights and privacy and so forth, yes, we may risk falling behind, but also there are a lot of national security. There is a lot of national security innovation that doesn't infringe on people's privacy, and so I think it would be a bit too too pessimistic to say that unless we go the route of the panopticon, we have no chance to compete with China in when it comes to national security. But it is an area that needs to be addressed. And I think actually with robust discussion between industry and government, and not just between industry and government, but between human rights watchers and government and industry, I think we can come to some sort of convergence as to what's needed. But what's not needed is what we have now, which is where there is just not very much understanding as to how much we are falling behind simply by not investing in R&D. And somebody said the other day, somebody from the US government with expertise in this area gave a very good sort of tagline, which is that China is investing in 16 Manhattan projects at any given time, which is 16 Manhattan projects at the moment. What is our Manhattan project? Do we even have one? We should have more than one.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Nick. Flying over here from Washington on the plane, I went back and watched that old movie, The Matrix. And in The Matrix, if you watch, I guess the second, in the series, you meet the architect of the Matrix. You are the architect to some degree of the Matrix when it comes to thinking about the application of data technology to warfare and how we think about that. So I'd like to ask you the same thing in that area of what you have helped create that infrastructure. What are the important areas that we need to know about what that capacity looks like today? How robust is it? How invulnerable is it right now when it comes to competition with some of our chief rivals?
I think that we did spend a number of years obviously building data architectures to handle extraordinarily large and diverse data set ingestion, integration, analysis, correlation, and enrichment.
Right.
But artificial intelligence processes are very different. Deep neural networks, adversarial neural networks, and things of that nature, they function fundamentally very differently in a much exponentially larger degree of parallelism than the traditional CPU is designed to handle. And that's why you see so many companies and so many organizations using GPUs in order to do that type of application today. When you have that exponential increase in computing power being applied to the data sets, everything else in the system now becomes a limiting factor, the speed with which you can move data. So the data service mechanisms such as storage, and especially the network itself, the network bandwidth required to drive this become, again, limiting factors and obviously preeminently fundamental to the successful performance of your AI training and development. So I agree with Elizabeth. We need to make a substantial national investment in artificial intelligence, even bigger than the ones that are happening at the JIC and in other industries. It has to be a concerted effort.
So are you saying now, just I mean not to interrupt, but is it not happening? Are we not making that investment? And I know here we're talking about the United States when in fact we're sitting in Slovakia. So the question is also among allies.
So you hit the nail on the head. I'm not entirely certain that we understand the magnitude and the importance of this from the senior policymaking level yet. We're getting an inkling, but it's Rado and I we correspond from time to time, and he's brought up some interesting footnotes to history. It was 1939 when Albert Einstein wrote that we needed to start a Manhattan Project. That was 2 years prior to the U.S. entry into World War II. We are, in order to obtain or maintain a competitive advantage, as the parlance of Washington goes, we're going to have to make a very sincere effort to invest in it. And we may be we'd be very wise to draw from our allies in order to leverage the expertise of the European Union and the United States. And it will have to be a massive public-private partnership in order for it to be successful.
Rado, you're out there in commercial sector and you've got that San Francisco accent, that Bay Area accent. But I know that you've invested and that you're one of the world's leading leaders in AI and looking at the application of this area. I want our lay audience, who's not necessarily expert in this, to understand what needles are we trying to move? What are we trying to accomplish in concrete ways that we can't accomplish without the kind of investment that Elizabeth and Nick have talked about?
Sure. You start also this question about AI in Manhattan Project. In fact, there is something called AI in Manhattan Project, which is kind of in the stage of thinking necessary due to something. You know, United States without allies has 5 times less PhD in AI than China. 5 times less PhD people in the AI space. So the human aspect
5 times less.
5 times
I just
less
want to understand.
PhDs.
That's a tweetable moment, if I've heard
Yeah,
one.
it's about 5 times less
yeah.
PhDs in AI.
Right.
China has more population than United States.
Right.
And they also invest a lot of, resources to, to science education. That's why they produce more PhD. And by the fact they have more people, they have more PhD. That's the simple reality. And that's basically when Nick said that the US has to work with the ally, because together with EU and other allies, now the population is roughly same, and then you start approaching number of the scientists to be comparable. So
Right.
I agree it's necessary to work with the allies. So, and let's basically describe why is concerted project, AI Manhattan Project, needed right now. Why now? Why the Manhattan Project started 2 years before war is not coincidence, because when Albert Einstein wrote that famous letter to Roosevelt, it's written in the way that technology development in fission reached the point that in few months down the road might be possible, not it will happen, but it might be possible to build such device and might be successful. So he was basically saying that basically inflection point in Einstein's mind will be next 6 months, where the technology fundamentally changed to next level quality. And Roosevelt took it seriously, and US spent the effort there. So let's ask question now, how far we are from inflection point fundamentally, where you have technology which your adversary cannot have, and you can do things which we cannot have. So generally it was believed that is 15 to 20 years away before the technology, the performance and cost drop to the level that you can build machine which exceed speed and capacity of human brain. And if it's 20 years away, then well, there is nothing really urgent to do today. And the reason why we cannot build that today is because it's just too expensive economically and so on. However, very recent development over last 2 years
Right.
Basically reached the point that you will be able to build such system in span of next 2 or 3 years. So basically human brain scale AI can be economically and technically built not 20 years away, but by 2022. So, since it's 2 years away, basically now if somebody misses the train by a year or 2, they will have not that technology. And once you have the technology which exceeds capacity and speed human brain, you have system which can develop the system which a human cannot. Yeah? And that gives you technology which your adversary cannot build. You cannot invent,
Right.
because you are limited by human brain capacity. So once you are past that inflection point, you are going very steeply out, and anybody behind that, the technological difference basically is increasing, not because they are more years behind, because the angle of improvement is steeper. So, the spread is increasing. So to conclude that, what I would like to sensitize, that situation is really serious, because major discontinuity and inflection point is less than 2 years away, as opposed generally believe it's 20 years away.
Well, let me ask you all, and Elizabeth, I'm going to go back to you, and I want you to pretend you're in this room, so intervene anytime when you want to react, you want to tell Rado or Nick how wrong they are on something, feel free. I do a lot of these forums on the coming age of technology, both in the national security space, but also, in the regular world. That 5G is really a placeholder for terms like AI, Internet of Things, quantum computing, smart cities, and how we're going to apply a whole new infrastructure of communications that moves big data through cities, sensors everywhere, so that we all see our lives enhanced, but it is, as Rado just described, operating in a way that's so much far beyond the capacity of a human brain or human control to deal with this. I think the same thing is going on, and I guess my question to you is, what should we be aware of or worry about on that front? I remember when Google Earth was created, and we had Google Maps going on, and I met Jim Clapper. I was one of the first media people that Jim Clapper agreed to meet when he began to meet media people. He didn't like journalists, but it was in there. But I asked him, I said, are you building, do you have Google? And there was a resistance to using anything that was in the commercial space, that it all had to be developed in the space that I'm sure that Nick helped build, which is, maybe better, but maybe different, but standalone. I'm just interested in how these worlds are going to interact. And as you look at that, is it going to be the smart cities application of these technologies that helps the United States, its allies, it helps NATO actually keep up and leapfrog ahead? Is that a fair question, Elizabeth?
Yes, it is. And if I may just make another point first, which is your lovely reference to the San Francisco accent, which is, as we all know, this a merry mix of all kinds of foreign accents and a mix of indeed American accents, which is what makes that melting pot so great, that innovation melting pot, that many people who have brilliant ideas will go there and come with their education and their ideas, and it benefits US society in the first place, and even US government. So when it comes to commercial innovation and to which extent it benefits national security, and whether it's a good thing for the US government, so I think that the dilemma that we have is that we as consumers expect constant progress. So we want life to become ever more convenient. And you mentioned smart cities and Google Earth. I don't need to remind anybody that we all rely now as ordinary citizens on Google Maps. I don't think most people would know what to do with a paper map. Well, all of that creates something that I think of as a convenience trap, where it's much easier for our adversaries to bring down society, to bring it to a standstill just by messing with or interfering with some of these services that we rely on a daily basis. I remember, for example, when the one internet provider in the UK went down for a day, and it created complete chaos because we didn't know how to find our way. I, for example, had to take the train, didn't know which train to take, and so forth. And I think that's something to bear in mind. Yes, it's a good thing that society is becoming ever more convenient, but it has national security implications. And then regarding the benefit of commercial innovation to the US government, I don't think there's any doubt that it benefits the US government. And In-Q-Tel is a fantastic tool for the US government to tap into this private sector innovation, and incidentally,
let me just stop you there for Elizabeth, so our audience, In-Q-Tel, which was the CIA's venture capital group to invest in new and emerging technologies in this space. I just want to make sure they knew. So sorry to interrupt you. Please go ahead.
No, I'll finish here, but In-Q-Tel is, I think, a fantastic example of what can be done to tap into the private sector innovation that's happening, and now other countries, including the UK, are trying to create similar setups.
Right. So let me ask you both, I mean, on this front as well, looking at how you swim along, you were just talking about this moment of discontinuity, this disruption that coming in 2 years. I can feel the tension, and from both of you about the choices we have to make, the investment we have to make. I'm just wondering, as I watch, a kind of technological determinism when it's coming about 5G. We also have the debate about Huawei, about communications infrastructure. What are the hard choices, Nick, that we really have to get right?
So we have to come to grips with a number of things at the policy and really the ethical levels around AI. They're going to influence how you do the funding and how you pursue the evolution of the technology in the marketplace as well. All technologies, literally from the time humanity picked up rocks so we didn't hurt our hands,
right,
are dual use inherently. So let's eliminate the idea that any technology has a specific type of use at all. How we choose to use the technology is bounded by our ethics. So the old way U.S. thought about it was stupid? I think it's inaccurate. It's not fair to say that it's stupid.
I see.
It might be unintentionally idealistic, but how we want to use a kitchen knife is really entirely up to us. That's the second item is understand that since the incentives for developing technologies are more emphatic in industry than they are in government, Don't be afraid to leverage good ideas coming from very small corners. And for that, In-Q-Tel was ideally and exquisitely designed. We need more of those types of innovation outlets for the U.S. government to encourage and foster and leverage commercial industry. The innovations are not going to come from the big companies. They never do. Google was a very small company when it invented its search capability. So we need to be very good at identifying nascent and small technology companies that have real potential. And the mechanisms are there. They're proven. So from the government perspective, can we do this? The answer is already yes. Are we bold enough to do it is the policymakers or the decision makers' decision to be made.
Brado, can I ask you to jump in on the same question, but I want to frame it a little bit, a little bit differently. In 1994, I interviewed Andy Marshall. Some of you may know Andy Marshall was the head then of net assessment at the Pentagon, and was spending a lot of time thinking about how China was looking at the world, looking at us, and they were writing then about the revolution in military affairs, the application of technology and information system to the soldier in the battleground in the field. This is well before the invasion of Iraq. This is well before. So looking at that, I just read H.R. McMaster's book, Battlegrounds, and it starts with him in the first Gulf War, in a tank. The first use of GPS and application of these systems in a battleground thing is probably a world that Nick knows well. So that was 1994. So what's that, about 16, 17 years ago from the moment that I first heard about this or thought about it to now. From now, asking me about these questions of hard choices and your concern about 2 years from now. What do we need to achieve? And when you think about that, you think forward where we're going to be jumping. And I always tell people that power is a function of future expectations, right? So if you think of China today, China's getting a premium because a lot of the marketplace out there looks at China as a growing ascendant power. They look at the United States as somewhat as a status quo power, and so you get a net plus or a net minus in the world how you're doing. So as you look at these hard choices, you look at the application of technology, going back to what Andy Marshall was talking about, what are the big changes that you're going to see coming up that we have to get right?
So let's look a little bit to history. A lot of technology from fighter planes, nuclear weapons, or space exploration came from money coming from the government, and then they trickle down to the commercial use, Teflon and so on.
So these are the DARPAs and kind of things?
This was the past. The reality is today going quite opposite. 2 years ago, CIA transitioned to manage their information services by Amazon, which is a big deal. CIA data centers are managed by Amazon. This is just prelude, basically
so
saying...
Jeff Bezos is running the CIA information systems?
Yes. You can
Another
Google it.
tweetable moment, I just want to note there.
So you can look at it. It was awarded projects, everybody complained, but that's what happened. But what I'm saying, this is not just the trend. The trend is speeding up because AI space, both from human capital and money invested, are in companies Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others. So most money in that space is actually in commercial sector.
Right.
And government is trying to get that innovation basically to the government, working with company who are not interested to work with government. Google clearly declare that basically their employees don't want to work with US government and they work closely with Chinese government.
Right.
So you will be relying on certain, trying to get cooperation from organization, commercial, who are not really motivated with you. So that's basically one problem. Second problem is to get to that discontinuity in 2 years, if you look how much military and government consume from semiconductor content, it's like 3%. So even you enlarge that by 3 times, there is not enough power to move whole industry to this new paradigm. So the needle will be moved only from commercial industrial space. And the question is how the government can incentivize, can create environment that basically commercial entity financially is beneficial to actually use dual-use technologies. To build data center, which through the day you use for Facebook, Google, because people are browsing and using that. When they go to the sleep, these machines are idle. We have $3 to $5 billion data center, which is useless half the time. US government cannot build $5 billion supercomputer. They are $500 million supercomputers. That's why they cannot get the capability of human brain scale AI because it's too expensive. But if you set up environment that this huge commercial infrastructure you can use when it's not used for dual purpose uses, you can basically achieve economically bring this government scale AI to whole industry. So what will be different about human brain scale AI is that previous technology came from the government and government controlled them. And there was belief that human brain scale AI will be coming from Chinese government and US government. Europe is quite behind. They are investing a lot of money, €1 billion to European Human Brain Project, but nevertheless is behind. So it was talking which government will have this technology first. But what we are seeing, because of dynamic and economy of the scale, it will be actually opposite. It will be commercial sectors working, giving government this capability to get there. So therefore, this capability will not show up just to governments. It will show up into 5, 6 private entities same time as the government. So this is very unique dynamic.
So this may seem like a stupid question because I'm naive and I'm a layperson in this, but is that on the Chinese side what Huawei represents? Does Huawei represent the private sector, the so-called private sector partner with government? And that is what is driving our national security anxiety around the world among our allies, is that exactly what you described as being the way forward for US is what China has achieved?
If I may,
Yeah.
The difference is in how the two systems are set up. China is an example of how government and industry are very tightly coupled even when they're private industry. And the United States and the European Union are examples of how industry and government are loosely coupled or decoupled altogether. Rado and I have talked about this a long time. The government literally lost its innovation lead as the primary driver for R&D and technology in the United States in 1968. Yes, 1 year before we went to the moon. And the significant event was the founding of a company called Intel, because Intel was an engineering technology for government consumption. And historically, the government was the driver of new innovation, and then it was propagated by commercial industry. Now that model is reversed. Industry develops technology that is subsequently adopted by the government. And that's, you would think that something like Neuralink, which Elon Musk is working on, would be something that would have come out of DARPA. Nope. So a man-machine interface, which is really something that is going to drive AI and human augmentation to enhance and accelerate decision-making, which is really the whole reason why we build information systems at all. These things are not coming out of the government. They are coming out of, of private industry, and that's going to raise a lot of questions about what do we want to know, what kind of decisions we want to make. I can't wait to see the FDA have to do a human trial and approvals on a man-machine interface, but cochlear implants and ocular implants have already given us sort of a template for what that's going to look like. So we're living in very interesting times. To Rado's point, we're at an inflection in terms of the acceleration of computing capacity on a per socket level.
Right.
We are also now at the culmination or the inflection of a real implementation of technology that cybernetically marries human beings to augmenting systems. And how we're going to make all of this work is really going to be driven by what are the benefits going to be to people on a day-to-day basis. And I am very interested in Elizabeth's thoughts on the topic.
I'm going to jump to Elizabeth. Rado, you're going to jump in 2 seconds?
Very briefly on that, you brought a very important point, which I was trying to say, that this discontinuity will be driven by economic power of mixing commercial and government level. And that integration is much better in China. And if we recognize that, we have to adapt to that and bring this model which is necessary for this discontinuity to happen. So I'm agreeing with you.
Okay. Elizabeth, let me ask you to answer the same question, but also, I'm interested in again, coming back to the warfare application. One of the big debates that's come up throughout this conference at GLOBSEC is hybrid war. This morning we had a lot of discussion about, you know, the issues of what Russia did with Ukraine and Crimea, but the application and the testing, essentially, of what we have been talking about in battlefield, in kinetic war, and kinetic conflict. And I know that's part of what you're thinking about and doing. And I don't mean to, again, sound silly, but, you know, we've got a lot of young people in this audience. They all look clean cut. I don't know if they have tattoos secretly and wear goth atmosphere, but we often talk about, you know, hackers out there and dark rooms and, you know, folks that, you know, have, you know, it's a very different crowd. If you read a novel by David Ignatius of the Washington Post, and he reads one of his novels about, you know, the future tech competition, those folks don't look like us, I think. And so I'm sort of interested in, you know, you know, the messier side, the uncomfortable side of the application of this in real warfare. I don't know if I'm articulating it well enough, but all I know is this is a polite corner, unless people have other sorts of. But when you think about AI, you think about hacking, you think about malware, you think about taking down grids and systems and banks and energy as part and disinformation warfare. I'm just interested in how all of this converges and what should be our priority in understanding that.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Nick. I'm hearing an echo here, but I hope you can hear me okay. So I just want to follow up on what Nick said. I think that the challenge that we have is, and I would hate to challenge Adam Smith, but really the invisible hand doesn't work for national security technology. And so if I look at the sort of companies that I saw pop up, and many survived, many did not. But during 5 years of reporting for San Francisco, those companies were all the result of some guy having discovered a niche where we needed something, a tech solution to it. So if there weren't enough parking spots in San Francisco, some guy would invent an app to find parking spots in San Francisco. And if all hotel rooms were taken, some guys would invent something that's now known as Airbnb. But most people are just not familiar with national security challenges and what it is we need. And I'm not proposing conscription to familiarize every single American with today's national security needs. It would be a completely preposterous idea. But what I am proposing is that we need to bridge the civil-military divide so that ordinary geniuses, as it were, tech guys and women have a better understanding of national security, not just when it comes to tenders from the US government where they get to participate. It has to come before that. And I wonder if some sort of immersion courses where they would get to see what the national security challenges are that face America and its allies, what those are. I think that would encourage them to innovate in that direction rather than to come up with civilian applications that, yes, at some point may benefit the US government or allied governments, but only as an indirect benefit. And then with regards to your question about hybrid warfare, so yes, this is the new frontier, and I'm happy to discuss it more later, but the reality today is that we as civil society, including industry and the wider public, are the front line in this geopolitical standoff. And it makes complete sense for adversaries to target the civilian part of our society simply because we are so vulnerable and we aren't used to thinking about national security. And that's a good thing, but that's why it becomes even more important for us to become more resilient. And I'm happy to discuss that more later. I'm not saying we should be engaged in any sort of offensive action against our adversaries, but just make ourselves more resilient so that it becomes less attractive to target us.
Thank you for that. I just saw my friend, the American ambassador, looking at me sort of strangely when I asked this question about, you know, tattoos and goths and others. So my apologies on that. But I mean, I think that you know, I wonder whether there is this cultural gap. I've talked to people like General, you know, Paul Nakasone of the National Security Agency, Mike Rogers, his predecessor, about whether or not the culture that we have in, you know, the U.S. You know, military and national intelligence establishment is one that appeals to what you just called, you know, those young geniuses that are out there that are, you know, swimming in different currents. Well, you know, Nick, how do you see it?
Well, there's a series of threads there that I kind of want to pull at the same time. I came up in the Army at a time when we were digitizing the battlefield.
Right.
So we wanted to connect everything. We wanted to be able to sense more, see more, and know more in order to be able to understand the environment and then act. Hybrid warfare is, well, as the French would say, plus ça change, plus que même chose. Everything old is new again. Deception is the heart of warfare.
Right.
That's actually a Chinese precept. The ability to control information and information dominance and information shaping operations is not any different, but the cyber domain and the combination of the physical domain, the traditional warfighting domains, and now cyber creates new opportunities or new threats. They're really two sides of the same coin. America has always... Sure, Elizabeth?
I just wanted to agree with you. I think it's ridiculous when it's being proposed that hybrid warfare is something new, because every war is by definition hybrid. It involves a kinetic and non-kinetic elements, and that's why I like the concept of gray zone warfare, which is obviously in the gray zone between peace and war, which is what we experience every day now. But I'm so glad you pointed out that aspect of hybrid.
So to really wrap all of this together, now that we have literally connected everything and we have access to tremendous quantities and qualities of information, what we're really trying to do is accelerate our decision making so the time to decisive action and really effective and efficient action is much shorter. In the cyber realm, because of the velocity with which computers can move, you almost have to do this with artificial intelligence to have any kind of competitive advantage as well. And companies and agencies that I work with are actually, very aggressively exploring this. But to bring all of it together is going to take, well, obviously, a tremendous combination of very good policy making, very strong alliances, and then leveraging those aspects of our society. The young modern generation are obviously, we grow up and become old, and we're the digital natives that will ultimately lead the country. To foster in them that what they can do can positively impact the national conversation and national activities is something we really have to do at this level. They have incredible skills, but they don't understand necessarily at a given age that what they can do can be tremendously beneficial to the country and to the future.
And so you see that as a problem. I mean, I've heard that it is a problem.
I don't know that we're capitalizing on the intellectual and educational and technical prowess of our younger generation as effectively as we could. Yes.
Yeah, so actually you brought In-Q-Tel as example, and actually I interacted with them and know them. But In-Q-Tel on capital front is way less than 1% these days of the capital market. So, significantly less than 1% of young generation technologies, when they are starting their company, will interact with them and align that, because the percentage of this capital share is dropping. Also, investments to technology and semiconductor space in the United States is declining over the last 10 years. So, and because we understand that basically this new technology will migrate not from government to commercial space, but from commercial to basically government space, policy has to recognize and dramatically increase the investment in that area. And there is one more aspect. That counterintuitiveness of certain policies, when Trump administration decide to basically limit investment into semiconductor space from China, hoping that it will increase the competitive advantage, actually it was opposite result. What happened, semiconductor industry, 30 to 40% money coming to innovation disappear, coming from China, but it was not supplemented and replaced by similar money coming from US. So this money just disappeared and it further slowed down innovation. So the result was counterintuitive than was original intent to increase separation. But because the policy of previous administration forgot about, and current administration forgot to plug the hole which will be created, and hole was there, it slowed down the innovation. So going forward, it has to be more thoughtful. If certain money to certain sector innovation disappears, it has to be replaced. If you don't replace, the harm is bigger than the intent you have.
Great. I'm going to open the floor to people. There's so many other dimensions of this world that we could get to, but let me open the floor to questions. We have one right in the front. And I'm going to ask you to go to the microphone here one by one, and then pose your question, and we'll proceed. Tell us who you are, by the way.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. I'm Roger Hilton. I'm a Defense and Security Research Fellow here from, I'm originally coming from Canada, a G7 country, which spends somewhere between 5 to 10% of its defense budget on R&D. We talked a lot about DARPA, and I'm sure all of you know.
Right.
These concepts like mosaic warfare, the connection of everything. Only last week, we had the U.S. Air Force shoot down a ballistic missile with a howitzer. You're reading about these portable servers and soldiers being now turned to code. So my question to you is, how would you counsel countries here in Central and Eastern Europe, Albania, Croatia, Romania, Slovakia, how are they going to get in on this, where even for a country like Canada, which has far deeper financial resources, are already way behind? So any sort of input or counsel on this would be welcomed.
Terrific. Thank you. Thoughts?
So this is, it's a very good question. And what are the mechanisms for doing it, and what's the purpose? So Simon Sinek says start with why. I think that you really need to start with what. So what is the benefit to both sides of the alliance relationship? What do those countries need to be able to do? And then how should we go about it? This is actually why these alliances exist. NATO can actually provide a mechanism for sharing those kinds of information technologies. I do an awful lot of work in my day job with the Canadian government in addition to the US government. So that one's easy because they're right next door and we work pretty closely together. The more distant components of the alliances, we need to get closer to. So where do we create, what I propose is really policy driven, is creating those mechanisms for technology sharing and technology aggregation and integration. So call it a technology integration center because, or technology integration center of excellence, because that's the phrase du jour. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for us to do it. We see the nascent steps for doing that very similarly to what we've done with our more traditional military exercises in the past.
Right.
Thanks, Steve.
Rado, any quick thought?
Yeah, so basically it boils down to economy. Since it will come from basically commercial sectors,
right.
These small countries with 5 to 10 million people population, they cannot have enough economic power to invest to get this technology. So only way how they can be part of larger alliance. For example, if they are member of EU is like 500 million people. It has economic power to amortize cost of these technologies. So basically, that's the reason why you have alliance. Be part of the alliance, and you have to share and divide the cost and share that cost between a larger group of the countries if you want to keep up with monolithic big country like China. So it's about the size of the economy and the resources you can throw to the development.
Let me get another question, which I'll direct to Elizabeth in a minute, but what I'll say, it's always sort of been on my map of trying to understand this. On one hand, when you're trying to sort of do what Rado, Nick, and Elizabeth talked about, create a proactive capacity in this AI space, that's one part of this. The other side is when you look at a country like North Korea, or you look at Iran, you look at some of the maliciousness in the malware that's out there with its, you have another disruption. I don't know how North Korea has developed this capacity, given how closed off and limited it is from much of the world. It'd be a whole other seminar we can do. So to me, I think one of the things we have to test ourselves on is whether or not we're making faulty assumptions about the size of a nation or a budget of a nation being an indicator of excellence in this area. I think it's one of the interesting areas where nations can leapfrog both in bad directions and good directions. At least that's my thesis. We can come back to later. But let's get your question. I'm going to ask Elizabeth to take the first crack.
Thank you. So my name is Victor Such. I work here at the National Security Program here in GLOBSEC. And my question is to all participants or speakers. I was going to ask, it was mentioned here that now the companies are the drivers of innovation and governments are trying to get on how to use this technology for their ends. And my question is, how do we make sure here in the West that these companies create this technology, this dual-use technology? How do we incentivize them? And also, given the fact that obviously companies are driven by profit, how do we make sure that this technology stays in our hands and is not bought by Iran, China, or Russia through a proxy, for instance, that the companies didn't ever see coming? So how do we make sure it stays here?
Great question. Elizabeth, did you hear that?
Yes, I did. An excellent question. So how do we incentivize companies? So every company wants to make money, and there is money to be made from government contracts. It's just, I think, the challenge is to help especially startups realize that if they innovate in a way that benefits the government and national security more generally, they cannot just do a good thing for the country, which is clearly can't be the sole motivation for a country, but they can actually do commercially very well as well. And so again, that starts with immersion, with introducing the tech community, as it were, in the first place, but others as well, to the national security challenges of today, so that they can think about it accordingly. Because otherwise, we have the situation, maybe a little bit, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but where the best tech guys and women of today innovate or come up with a new parking app because that's the need they see. And then when it comes to making sure that our best tech companies and other cutting edge companies are not bought up by foreign countries, it's a hugely relevant question. It's one that has concerned me for a long time, and now parliaments are beginning to act, parliaments and governments. So the situation we have had is that there have been regulators like CFIUS in the US, which is actually the best regulator from my perspective, and in other countries as well. But they have had a quite narrow definition, as defined by the legislators, as to what constitutes national security. So a lot of companies, especially small companies, tech startups, have been acquired by especially Chinese buyers because it flew under the radar of the regulators and of legislators. So in the case of, in the US, for example, sort of a ridiculous example, but one that illustrates the situation is the case of Grindr, which is a gay dating app. And why should CFIUS worry about the gay dating app? Well, when it's acquired by a Chinese company and the data then becomes available to the Chinese government by extension, that is a national security issue. And then, as many here will be aware, when that happened in the US, CFIUS woke up and forced a reversal of the acquisition. But then the new buyer who then bought Grindr turned out to be connected to the original Chinese buyer. So I used to work in corporate investigations, and it's really important to check not just who the immediate buyer is, but who's behind that buyer.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Responses? Any response real quick? Yes,
Yeah, I would basically start that re-emphasizing my previous point that it's really only economic incentive will work. You know, CFIUS actually was like elephant in porcelain. You know, yes, they can stop the acquisition, stop money flowing from China to these applications, which means that development will slow down because there are not money for acquisition. You can only do it if simultaneously you replace that missing money with something else, which did not happen. So, you know, current effect of CFIUS actually negates original goal. So it has to go with complement with economical incentives. And you know, when somebody starts startup company and has the investors, his job is not to serve national security and be altruistic. His job is deliver a return on the investors. So the only way how you can do it is to give them incentive increase from 0.1%, for example, in QTEL, to be 5 to 10% of the capital market, and then 10% of new entrepreneurs will basically touch with that. And if they can make the profitable and they receive money for their job, that will incentivize them to national security. So my conclusion is, for commercial sector, only economic incentives will really deliver what we want.
Right. Nick, last word? Elizabeth, last word.
Yield.
Sorry, I'm interrupting here from afar because I can't wave at you. So I just wanted to add to what Rado just said, which is something that I've thought about. If the Chinese can't buy these companies and they want to be acquired, who should acquire them? And I think that's where there is potential for more organizations or commercial outfits operating on behalf of governments along the lines of In-Q-tel. So if a company, a tech startup, for example, if it is so desirable that a Chinese buyer will buy it, it's clearly desirable for us as well commercially. So it would be, I think, a good deal for the taxpayer if we had more outfits like In-Q-tel who could acquire companies that have
Right.
promising technology, and then as they grow, they will obviously pay dividends for the taxpayer.
Let me just say in conclusion, or you want to say
Elizabeth just took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And there's a secondary piece to this too. If we can invest in the United States, if we can invest billions of dollars to save our economy by government intervention into the financial instrument markets, then why can't we do the same thing for another core component of our national power, which is our technology basis? So we've proven we can spend the money to do this. So it's not a legislative or a regulatory issue.
But it requires a plan and it requires strategy.
It requires a vision and a strategy to execute, exactly.
Let me just say in conclusion, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I think your question was excellent, and I'll give you my 2 cents on it because, this is where, I think you're the ambassador here to represent the diplomacy is so important. So it's a topic we haven't talked about this morning, but rules making, international rules making, and diplomacy in these areas is very important. When you read Tools and Weapons, by Brad Smith about AI and the applications that the technology sector is developing that can be developed, the question is, should they be applied? And that decision is going to be a negotiation. Now, in China, Microsoft made the decision not to cooperate with China in that particular area, but no one forced Microsoft to make that decision, nor did a government, nor did anyone else. It was one of those things. But it raises the interesting question that you said of whether or not we should begin in certain key areas, begin as a set of allies and nations to begin thinking about what those protocols that should be negotiated should be. I think it's very important. But then on another part, we have the Nobel Prize that was just given this week to 2 outstanding women in science who helped develop CRISPR. And we saw, CRISPR is this technology in genetic editing that has, affected everything from healthcare to crops, potentially, and a rogue scientist in China applying this in bad ways, and sort of looking. So it shows exactly to your point of question, how do you do that? Now, to the Chinese government's credit, they put that person in jail, I think. They created it, but it was a function of norms, and so the discussion of norms also needs to be part of this discussion. And then I'll say one other element on the Huawei issue and some of this in the capacity is just to kind of emphasize what Elizabeth and Rado and Nick just said. I've been watching this Huawei debate unfold, and frankly, I'm one that has had concerns about a kind of demonization of a company without knowing more information into this. I think it can be very problematic. Nonetheless, if you are going to take that strategy and draw a line and say that infrastructure will be ripped out and we're going to create 2 different universes for that, then there has to be a plan and strategy either to make Nokia and Ericsson, which are the other 2 providers in that area, huge and help them spread to kind of fill the market, or to build a different kind of capacity in the United States, none of which is happening right now. So it's one thing to complain, it's another thing to build and think and plan and invest. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues here. Nick Psaki is former Chief Intelligence Information Architect for the U.S. Army, Rado Danilak, CEO of Takium, and Elizabeth Braw, Senior Research, well, she's now visiting fellow in National Security at the American Enterprise Institute and working there, and I look forward to seeing her in Washington. So thank you all very much for your questions, and thank you for today. Big round of applause to all of you.
Thank you.